Hi there everyone. So this is the third of three little narrated PowerPoints for SLK 753 for in lecture 2. So in this PowerPoint, we're gonna look at the competencies of community psychology practitioners. This will be our source text. I indicate the specific page numbers in red, and I just want to remind you that you can get this chapter from ClickUp. It's under reading materials, and we'll just be looking at pages 42 to 50. However, I strongly recommend that you read the rest of the chapter. It applies competencies to a specific community situation, and it also looks at the differences between community psychology, clinical psychology, and school psychology, the overlaps and the differences, I should rather say. Okay, so if you go to page 48 of Elias, we can talk about the content of this slide. So according to the authors, one can look at the competencies for community psychology as a toolbox. Every skill or competency will be one of the tools in the toolbox, and depending on the situation, the community psychology practitioner will decide which tool to use. In some situations, a hammer is needed, and in other situations, more subtle tooling is necessary. Maybe sandpaper, a few nuts and bolts will achieve the goals of the intervention. So the point is that we never go into a situation with a set plan, like use the hammer, then use the screwdriver, then use the monkey wrench. What we do is we evaluate the situation and then decide which tools are best to use in this specific context. It is therefore clear that values and competencies of a community psychology practitioner will drive the tool selection. It's what you understand from what is happening that will decide for you how you will implement these values and competencies. So no psychology practitioner will be excellent in using all of these tools. Or as it's put on page 44, no individual community psychologist is expected to possess or flawlessly execute all of the 18 competencies, and their expertise will vary between the competencies. These authors highlighted that skill level in applying these competencies in community practice therefore depends on three things: exposure, experience, and expertise. This module will definitely do the first. We will definitely expose you to the competencies, and we will provide you some experience too. However, you should note that community practitioners are always in the process of learning and gaining expertise in all or some of the competencies. Experience and expertise is therefore shaped by further training, working in communities, and lifelong learning. So competencies have a specific role. They help us define community psychology practice within the broad realm of helping professions, those that also work in communities of all types. The competencies therefore can play the role of clarifying the identity of community psychologists. We do not have exclusive ownership of these competencies. There are overlaps with other professional fields that need similar skill set and approaches. These 18 competencies, however, helps us to define what our client community can expect for us. So you will look at table 2.1 on page 44. So the first category that can be found is foundational principles. And it includes 5 concepts which you'll notice overlaps with the values from Visser. This is because these foundational principles are reflective of the broader field of community psychology and are the basis on which the other 13 competencies are used in communities. According to Elias, these are foreground processes as we have to constantly pay attention to these principles as we do not automatically operate according to these concepts. It is therefore necessary that we check ourselves the whole time as we practice community psychology to make sure that our actions are in fact aligned with these principles. That is also why a large part of your assessment is about encouraging you to be reflective and reflexive community psychology practitioners, as using reflective skills is very important in our field. And also in clinical counseling and educational psychology as well. I'm not going to discuss each concept as they're very well explained in this table. I would like to highlight the first concept of ecological perspectives though. Later in this module, we will be spending some time on systems or ecological theories, as this is such a vital lens to use in community psychology practice. I would just like to add that I'd replace cross-cultural competence with the words diversity competence. Diversity is a broader term, it's more broader than cross-cultural, and it can include issues such as religion, sexual identity, orientation, and gender. So I think it would be better to be diversity competent or diversity savvy than just cross-cultural. Community program development and management. So this second category points very much to your activities in your psychoeducational intervention, as it refers to the community psychology practitioner's ability to develop and implement programs from start to finish. Your intervention is quite small, but it will give you a good idea of all the various aspects of program development, implementation, and management. For example, you are partnering with stakeholders, you are formulating program goals, you are researching best practices in order to develop your psychoeducational intervention. Number 7, prevention and health promotion, again highlights the preventative and the promotative focus of community psychology practice. Even when there is already maladaptive behavior and functioning, we work towards empowering communities to prevent further maladaptiveness. This section is about community and organizational capacity building. Again, the information in this table is very clear, so I won't be rehashing the information in this table. The skills in this category clearly is all about relationship building, which includes building trust between community psychology practitioners and various stakeholders, but also between all the stakeholders themselves. An interesting factor is number 10, resource development. Resource development requires that community psychology practitioners are able to look with creative eyes at community situations to identify assets and resources that may not be regarded necessarily as being positive or as being a resource. We in a way have to be like the Scandinavian countries that are running out of rubbish and waste because they use it to generate power. Instead of looking at landfills and rubbish dumps as stuff that has absolutely no value, they adjusted their whole approach to waste, and now their waste is valuable, whereas ours in South Africa is taking up too much valuable land and puts strains on the planet. In your community, try to keep your eye open for unexpected strengths or resources. Look at what you consider to be weaknesses or challenges and try to reconstruct them in such a way that they can be resources. This next slide refers to a grouping, community, and social change. This is one of the more complicated groupings that works towards a second order change process. That is, processes focusing on ways to rearrange existing relationship, roles, and power dynamics within a specific setting, working towards a more just, a more inclusive, and therefore more health and well-being promoting environment. This category also refers to collaboration between community psychology practitioners and stakeholders to enable sustainable systemic change. What I mean by that, as soon as the community psychology practitioner leaves, the intervention is able to carry on its own. It has its own steam and its own drive because people are empowered. They understand the social dynamics there, the power issues involved, and they have learned or have ways to negotiate this. Numbers 15 and 16 would be beyond the scope of your project, but you will definitely learn the first three competencies in your community project. Okay, as shown as in the previous PowerPoint, we showed you that community psychology, we try to integrate research and practice. And I remember I called it reflexive practice. So you will also do this in your project as you'll be doing an evaluation of your intervention. And although you will not use pure participatory community research methodologies such as action research or photo voice, you'll be getting input, that is your needs and resource analysis from your community, and use their input to develop an intervention. That intervention will be peer evaluated by everyone in your class and us, your lecturers, and you will then have to adjust your intervention given the feedback. This somewhat reflects a participatory community research method and will give you a flavor of how it is to create knowledge outside of the ivory tower, but together with a community. Community psychology practitioners regard it as very important that their research is disseminated within their client communities, but also to other community psychology practitioners. I find the community psychology community to be very generous in this regard. So now what? So at this point you might be scratching your head, asking yourself, what do I do now with all this information? And I want to catch you before you categorize it under the theoretical knowledge file in your mind. I want you to stop and I want you to think about reflective practice. We asked you in lecture 1 to start with a reflective diary. These values and competencies is what you will use to reflect with. You can, for example, look at the first grouping, at foundational practices, before you go to your first meeting with your community stakeholders. You can write reflective notes on which aspects of these competencies you should remember to focus on or have questions about. You can look at the values of community psychology and, for example, brainstorm with your co-facilitators about how a value like self-determination would look amongst yourself and your community. You can draw, write, vlog on any of these aspects covered in the videos and narrated PowerPoints. If you are consistent and expect yourself to really think about these things, you will see that the reflective aspects we expect of you in your 2 individual assignments will be deep and rich. We honestly can see in these reflective assignments which student dared themselves into real growth and which students were not willing to question their own beliefs, values, and actions. I hope that you will choose to embrace the growth that comes from reflective and reflexive practice. Okay, so reflective practice for this part. Good to get to know yourself a bit better and kick off the reflective aspect of your community psychology journal. Write for 15 minutes about your upcoming community intervention. You can do it by completing the following sentences. I know. I want. I'm scared of. It's important to me too. What I have to offer to the co-facilitation team is, it makes me feel like I have personal power in a new activity like this when These are suggestions only, and we encourage you to find other ways in which to express your values, views, beliefs, experiences, and wishes, included in your individual assignments where appropriate.